B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Tuesday, November 5th, 2019. And my news and comment stack is just full today. Lots of news, and I never have any shortage of comments. I am a man with too many opinions. And I want to thank listener John Zwiebel for sharing a clip with me that I'm going to lead with today. He is perhaps one of the biggest boosters of Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard in her candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president. And I strongly support Tulsi Gabbard's participation in the race. I value her voice, her call to end regime change wars. And recently, she visited with 9/11 families and became one of the first Democrats to break silence on the 9/11 cover-up that lingers to this day and that is a factor in those regime change wars that opposition to has become a centerpiece in the Gabbard campaign. Here is a clip from her appearance with the 9/11 families in New York City.
Because of what happened on that day, like so many Americans, I made a decision to answer the call to serve, to use my life to defend the safety and security of the American people, proud to wear the uniform of our country. I was determined to defeat and destroy the evil that visited us on September 11th. The safety and security of the American people is exactly why we are gathered here today. Families who lost their loved ones want the truth, and they deserve the truth. They want answers. They deserve answers. The American people deserve to know exactly what happened and who was behind it. Now, 15 out of the 19 attackers were Saudi citizens. And there are still, even as we are approaching 20 years after this attack took place, there are still ongoing questions as to whether the Saudi government or personnel within their government were involved in any way with this attack, how they aided the attackers. There's been an investigation into this question, but to date, those findings are being kept hidden from these families who are gathered here today and from the American people. This is absolutely unacceptable.
So there's Tulsi Gabbard. And while I would have framed it differently, she doesn't explicitly call out the cover-up, and she states that the common belief that al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. And I don't know that to be true. I know there was a cover-up. And that is what I focus on in my coverage of the 9/11 narrative. But this is so significant. To have a candidate for president, even one who's polling at 3 or 4%, I acknowledge her stature. But the courage that she's showing to take on the monstrous narrative that we know isn't true, and to demand truth on behalf of the families and the American people, well, I consider this to be a significant step forward. And I applaud her for the courage that she shows in taking on such a topic. If she had a big campaign staff with advisors and pollsters, they'd say, Tulsi, don't touch this. It is the third rail. It is certain death in American politics today. And Tulsi Gabbard doesn't listen to that. And I, for one, am very glad about it. Over at BuzzFeed today, Rosie Gray spends 16 pages analyzing whether Gabbard will run as a third-party candidate. This is all prompted by Hillary Clinton's rumor-mongering, where she accused Gabbard of being a Republican plant who's being groomed for a third-party run. Apparently, the clarification in Hillary's comments on the podcast where she smeared Tulsi Gabbard, she was referring to a Republican in that particular context. That's what we are told. At any rate, the article here is very consistent. Gabbard insists that despite her fight with the party's establishment, she would never split off from the Democratic primary for a third-party run. She has given the same answer in many different cases. After a town hall in Columbia, South Carolina, just last Saturday, she was asked whether there were any circumstances under which she would change her mind. No. Answer's still the same. Nope. On CNN, Jim Sciutto asked her in August. I will not. I've ruled that out. So I'm going to take her at her word, and if she changes that position, she better have a really good excuse. But I do think that she is being honest. I don't know what her plans are. She must know, like all of us, that becoming the nominee is probably out of her reach. But I want to call out my buddy Billy Cook up in Humboldt County, Eureka, Arcata. It's just as I was getting ready to do the podcast today, he put up a post on Facebook. And by the way, I love Billy, and he's a big Bernie Sanders booster. So he posted betting on a 50-50 chance that Tulsi Gabbard becomes a Fox News correspondent after the 2020 election. Now, Dennis Kucinich became a Fox News commentator after he left politics. So I don't consider that to be, some sort of a death sentence or some sort of self-marginalization. And, she takes a lot of flack because she appears on Fox News and she appears on RT, but she's never been invited to be on MSNBC. I think there was one obligatory interview with Rachel Maddow early in the process here. But Rachel Maddow hasn't even covered the back and forth between Gabbard and Hillary Clinton. Hasn't touched it. Now, I was unable to watch a couple of nights when my power was off, so it's possible she did while I wasn't watching. And Billy Cook is free to speculate any way he wants. But the message behind this is that if she goes to Fox News, she is some sort of a sellout. And I take umbrage at that, because I think that there are a lot of people who would like to be interviewed in media outlets that might be more favorable or have a better optic perception. But to tag her as, some sort of a Fox News asset is just one rung below calling her a Russian asset. And I reject that. Now, here's one for Billy and the Bernie fans. Alan McLeod at Mint Press News is confirming my recent observations that the corporate media is trying to write Bernie Sanders out of the story. Even when he shows up tied or ahead of other Democrats in matchups, even when he shows up in polls beating Donald Trump by a greater margin than his competitors, well, it gets buried. I pointed it out yesterday. There was an Onion post about how Bernie Sanders' numbers have dropped by an increase of 5% in some poll. And over at MSDNC, not only do they marginalize Tulsi Gabbard, but in July, its graphics team decided that Sanders' 49% support was lower than Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, who were showing 48%. I don't know what poll that was or what listing it was, but that kind of treatment is very obvious. And you see the cases where they set up graphics and they move Sanders either out entirely or, into footnote territory. And here's an example that McLeod cites recently. The Hill published results of an Emerson College survey with the headline, Trump beats Warren, Biden in Iowa matchups. But as many pointed out, the most important news from the poll buried was that Sanders was leading Trump in Iowa. There was no mention of Bernie in a recent New York Times article on the front runners. Likewise, the coverage of his enormous New York rally, where he was formally endorsed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was sparse. There was a story in the New York Times, but not much coverage otherwise. And a new University of North Florida poll took Bernie blackout to new levels, says McLeod. In a poll of Democratic candidates against Trump and or Pence, they didn't even include Sanders, despite featuring candidates with far less support, like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Its faculty director, Michael Binder, claimed that the reason was, it was for reasons of diversity. What? Also, I want to recommend Elizabeth Voss. Her column today at Consortium News is headlined, "It's the DNC Stupid. Democratic Party, not Russia, has delegitimized the democratic process." She takes us back to 2016 and how the release of the DNC and Podesta emails at WikiLeaks demonstrated how the DNC had acted in favor of Hillary Clinton in so many different ways. And yet all of the focus was, well, it came from Russia, so it's tainted, and you shouldn't read that stuff, and if you do, you shouldn't believe it. Then she talks about David Brock's media operation, where he spent $2 million for his own online troll army under the name of Share Blue. Voss cites the LA Times describing the project as meant to appear to be coming organically from people in their social media networks in a groundswell of activism, when in fact it was a highly paid, highly tactical operation. Then there was the lawsuit against the DNC for fraud. And their defense lawyers argued in open court for the party's right to do whatever it wants, just like they used to in the smoke-filled rooms. And they don't owe party members or even donors any transparency or, balanced process. Basically, they argue that they can do whatever they want, and they have. So I think it's an interesting piece, worth your time. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. Well, you may have read the headline. A man in Colorado was about to blow up a synagogue near Denver, when, of course, our good friends and great protectors at the FBI swooped in to prevent him from blowing up some pipe bombs. Where did he get the pipe bombs? From his paid FBI informants. And it's fascinating. This showed up in my local newspaper, attributed to the Associated Press. And I'll just read you the first two paragraphs. A man who repeatedly espoused anti-Semitic views has been arrested in a plot to bomb a historic Colorado synagogue, federal officials said Monday. The co-conspirators in the plot turned out to be undercover agents who arrested the man shortly before he planned to bomb the synagogue early Saturday morning. And there was a third FBI agent, a woman, who won his confidence by posing as a white supremacist on Facebook. And there is a deeper report under the byline of Amber Jameson over at BuzzFeed. Headline, "A white supremacist was arrested for allegedly planning to blow up a synagogue," and likewise, you find out about the FBI agents in paragraph 2. Authorities said Richard Holzer, who was arrested Friday, plotted to blow up Temple Emmanuel Synagogue with Molotov cocktails or pipe bombs, and told undercover FBI agents he had previously paid a cleaner at the temple to put arsenic in the water to poison the congregation. And the FBI treats this like, DEFCON 4. When they were in control of this guy, and if you read the articles carefully, he presents as somebody who is mentally ill. His claim about putting arsenic in the water is dismissed by the leader of the synagogue, who said, well, that never happened. That's a total mess. And he appears to be delusional. These are the perfect candidates for the FBI frame-ups that have populated the so-called domestic terrorism efforts that the FBI has undertaken since 9/11. It's another ugly consequence of 9/11. It's why I respect Tulsi Gabbard for at least pulling the scab off a little bit and saying, hey, don't we deserve answers to these questions? And I would love to see her or other Democratic leaders call out the FBI for this pattern of entrapping people of limited mental acuity. We've seen this happen time and time again. And speaking of the FBI and frame-ups, I want to recommend a new documentary, and it'll take you a while to see it. It's showing at a film festival in St. Louis this weekend. It's called From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock. Today I'm releasing an in-depth interview with filmmaker Kevin McKiernan. And it's a fascinating story. McKiernan was in his early 20s when he went to Wounded Knee. He was an NPR reporter from Minneapolis, and he wound up almost embedded with the American Indian movement activists who took over the parts of the Pine Ridge Reservation there. And McKiernan details how FBI informants, including a guy who was the top security advisor to the leaders of the American Indian movement for 2 years, FBI informant, cases where they divided members of the movement by making it appear that one of them was an informant. And he gives a great recap of the mistreatment of Leonard Peltier, who remains in prison today, 46-plus years later. His two co-defendants were acquitted in a separate trial. And McKiernan shows or argues how they used a woman who had never met Leonard Peltier to provide evidence claiming that she witnessed his shooting of 2 FBI agents. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with filmmaker Kevin McKiernan.
But my big takeaway from Wounded Knee was the spiritual change that took place there. And as an outsider, a witness, I mean, I named the film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey, because it really, I don't speak for Native people, and I don't speak for the government, and I don't speak for other reporters. This is just what I saw during that 45-year period. And what I did see was a resurgence in the ceremonies of Indian people of all different tribes. There were scores of different tribes there who were represented. And in the end, I think that there was a feeling of reconnection with a power that existed in the old days. And I think that was the big takeaway that then spanned all those years to Standing Rock in 2016, when at one point, unlike Wounded Knee, at one point there were some 10,000 protesters at Standing Rock. And that was the largest assembly of Native people since the 1800s. So it was an extraordinary change that took place between those two seminal events, between Wounded Knee and Standing Rock. And I was a fly on the wall. I wasn't a player. I was, you might call me a kind of a hitchhiker on history. I just got to see certain things because of the fact that I was there with my recording devices.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Kevin McKiernan. I'll be releasing it to my subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. Also, I'm putting up a link to Kevin McKiernan's website with both today's podcast and the interview podcast, where you can keep tabs on the availability of the film. He said it will be available on DVD early in 2020. And I do encourage you to check it out if it comes to a film festival near you. My program, all my work, is supported by listeners like you who support me with your subscriptions. People like Jason Spitzer, Tom McAfee, Jim McHugh, and the fine folks at DGL. You know who you are. I'm grateful for your ongoing support of my work. I invite others to kick in a few bucks as well. We can always use more. I'm not making a killing doing this podcast, but it is great therapy. You can address your correspondence to me at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915, and all the information about subscriptions is on the sign-up page at peterbcollins.com. Good piece in the New York Times on the op-ed page today, attributed to Lawrence Pintack, Jonathan Albright, and Brian Bowe. They conducted studies on Twitter traffic aimed at demonizing two members of the squad, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. And what they discovered is fascinating. Out of 113,000 tweets posted from early September 2018 until the election in 2018 that mentioned either one of them, Omar or Tlaib, they found that roughly half of the 90,000 tweets mentioning Ilhan Omar included hate speech or Islamophobic anti-immigrant language. Put another way, almost 60% of the network of accounts that mentioned or tagged her had posted at least one tweet containing hate speech or overt disinformation. Now, they don't raise the question about why Twitter let those hate speech accounts remain open. Only Trump's allowed to do that, right? So they say that when they revisited the same accounts this past July, a significant portion of them were simply gone. Some had been suspended by Twitter for those hate speech comments, but many others had been deleted by the account holders. And the suspicion is that this reflects heavy bot activity. Now, we know that the only bots who meddle in American politics are Russians, but the study doesn't go into detail on where the traffic came from. Israel's Supreme Court ruled today that the government can expel the head of Human Rights Watch's Israel and Palestine office after accusing him of supporting BDS. Omar Shakir, a U.S. citizen, has, 20 days to leave the country. And it's interesting. Apparently, based on access to his Facebook account when he was a student at Stanford 4 years ago, where he expressed support for BDS, Shakir says that since he took the job with Human Rights Watch, he has expressed no public opinion on boycott, divestment, and sanction. But that doesn't matter, because Israel has decided he's one of the leaders of the BDS movement. Now, that's flatly untrue. I've met Omar Barghouti, the founder, the guy who originated BDS. And the court, in ruling that Shakir had violated the law, declined to address the constitutional arguments that had been raised. It simply said, get this guy and deport him. Now, I find it interesting because on a similar topic, Adam Milstein, who describes himself as a proud Israeli-American active philanthropist, posted an ad on my Facebook news feed, and I clicked over to his website. And there he attacks the BDS movement, flatly states that anyone who supports it is anti-Semitic, and attacks Students for Justice in Palestine, which held last weekend its annual conference, and I believe it was at the University of Minnesota. Yes, that's correct. So here's a lie from Adam Milstein. The BDS movement was established by major Palestinian terrorist organizations in 2001 as a non-military way to eradicate Israel. That's not true. Omar Barghouti is not a terrorist, not a member of any terrorist organization. But it doesn't matter when you have God on your side and you're practicing Hasbra, which is the Israeli legitimization of propaganda. So here's another lie. Its annual conference, that's Students for Justice in Palestine, serves as a conduit to push radicalism, violence, and anti-Semitism at colleges and universities across the nation. Here's another lie. The BDS movement seeks the destruction of Israel as the world's only Jewish state by isolating Israel from every other country through economic, cultural, academic, and diplomatic boycotts. Well, the idea here is you're supposed to change your behavior. They don't get that. One more lie here. If BDS leaders had their way, no nation would sell products to Israel or buy Israeli products. No nation would have diplomatic relations with Israel. See, they feel that they have some God-given right to persecute the Palestinians, and anyone who challenges that, they're the ones who are out of line. They're the ones who are trying to destroy Israel. But Israel's efforts to destroy the Palestinians don't even enter their minds. All right, one more lie. Yet we see almost no pressure to keep this violent, hateful incitement reminiscent of the Nazi-era boycotts of Jewish businesses off campuses and away from students. Well, they're not acknowledging the great Al Jazeera documentary that's been suppressed in this country. It's called The Lobby. Many of my listeners have watched it, and it details how the Israeli government is directly controlling the anti-BDS activities here in the United States. And at the University of California, Davis, a couple of years ago, they used really ugly tactics to disrupt an SJP meeting. And yet, Adam Milstein accuses SJP, the group's members, violently disrupt pro-Israel events and regularly bully and ostracize Jewish students. Maybe that's happened. but I know it has happened in the other direction. I want to commend Stephen Zunas, man I've known for over 10 years, professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, with a piece today at Truth Out, which gets the truth out about Joe Biden's shocking record in supporting Israel, even in its most virulent and violent activities against Lebanon and against the Palestinians. Joe Biden always says that it is self-defense on Israel's part. And in this article, Stephen Zunas shows that Biden is to the right of the Bush administration on extrajudicial killings conducted by the Israeli government. So it's a very well-written piece. And if you have any doubts about Joe Biden's policies on this particular set of issues, I hope you will take a look. Not too much going on in impeachment today. The House investigators issued a subpoena for Mick Mulvaney to trot over from the White House and have a chat with them on Friday. We know that's not going to happen. And it's fair to say that the current acting permanent White House chief of staff can declare executive privilege. I do think that he should go to Capitol Hill and declare it when certain topics come up. But, for example, can he claim executive privilege on the news conference that he called where he publicly stated that there was a quid pro quo around Ukraine and we should all get over it? I think not. But that's the stone wall that Trump is building instead of the one that Mexico was going to pay for along the southern border. Republicans looking for ways to commit more mischief and to disrupt the hearings being run by the majority Democrats. They want to put former wrestling coach Jim Jordan. He was the guy who ducked a scandal at Ohio State when he was the wrestling coach there. Well, they want to put Jim Jordan on the House Intelligence Committee, and they probably can do that, and it will just make for more antics. So let's see. Beyond that, oh, yeah, Lev Parnas, you know who he is? He's one of Rudy Giuliani's buddies. He was born in Russia, but he's an American citizen. And it's convoluted because Parnas originally hired John Dowd, who had been Trump's lawyer on Russiagate. And Dowd made claims that Parnas and his buddy Fruman could claim executive privilege for the work that they did for Rudy Giuliani as he was volunteering to work for Donald Trump. And I find that so far-fetched that it's even hardly worth mentioning. At any rate, Lev Parnas is not feeling the love from Trump, who said, I don't know them, I don't know about them, I don't know what they do. Maybe they were clients of Rudy. You'd have to ask Rudy. And asked about all the pictures he took with Lev and Igor. He said, I have a picture with everybody. So there is a little daylight there where Lev Parnas is indicating that he is willing to cooperate with the investigations and at least provide some documents. Mike Pompeo, who plays Secretary of State these days in the Trump reality show, he's getting heat because he continues to support Trump over the Ukraine intervention scheme that involved Giuliani and Rick Perry and these guys, Igor and Lev, and perhaps other characters. And so Pompeo is described as facing a revolt among his troops at the State Department because they want him to support the State Department, to support honest diplomacy, and to deplore and separate himself from the schemes of Rudy Giuliani. And so he is choosing his words very carefully. Most of the time when you see a reporter ask Pompeo a question these days, he just laughs at the question. He says it's an absurd question, and that's how he is ducking out of answering them. And Pompeo's also getting heat because he's been spending a lot of time in Kansas, his adopted home state, where everybody thinks he's going to run for the Senate next year, and he appears to be laying the groundwork for that, some of it at taxpayer expense. Pompeo also delivered the message that Trump ordered. He announced the formal notification to the United Nations that the U.S. is giving its one-year notice that it will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, and he does that on the same day that 11,000 worldwide scientists sign on to a declaration. Quote, "We declare clearly and unequivocally that planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. To secure a sustainable future, we must change how we live. This entails major transformations in the ways our global society functions and interacts with natural ecosystems. The climate crisis has arrived and is accelerating faster than most scientists expected. It is more severe than anticipated, threatening natural ecosystems and the fate of humanity." Just don't tell Trump. Meanwhile, a good, kind of interesting op-ed written, or it was published in the Washington Post today by Yael Eisenstaedt. He is a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech. He was formerly the elections integrity head at Facebook, and he was formerly a CIA officer and a White House advisor. So I don't know this guy at all, and I'm not vouching for him. But he went to work at Facebook, where he quit after about 6 months as head of the Global Elections Integrity Ops. And he argued that the real problem is that Facebook profits partly by amplifying lies and selling dangerous targeting tools that allow political operatives to engage in a new level of information warfare. Its business model exploits our data to let advertisers custom target people, show us each a different version of the truth, and manipulate us with hyper-customized ads. I think that's very accurate. Now, he makes a claim here that I don't agree with. Most users do not differentiate organic content, that's a post from one of your friends, from ads. And I see a big difference. And, as I'm scrolling through the news feed, I go right past the ads unless there's something that really matters to me. But I usually look and scrutinize who posted and what they said. So I do know the difference, and I believe that most of us who use Facebook do as well. A little bit later, he says the fact that we were taking money for political ads and allowing campaigns and other political organizations to target users based on the vast amounts of data we had gathered meant political ads should have an even higher bar for integrity than what people are posting in organic content. Some things to think about there. I want to credit Zoe Tillman. She writes for BuzzFeed News, and she doesn't do those silly celebrity listicles. She has been chasing a story for over a year where the Inspector General of the Justice Department issued redacted information about claims that a high-ranking Justice Department official who'd been there through the Obama years had raped and sexually harassed 5 different women. So she stayed on the story, and this September got the Inspector General's report, a 12-page document that is redacted. And she says that she can confirm that the individual in the Inspector General's report is named Edison Aponte. He'd been at the DOJ since 1994. He was Associate Deputy Director in the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which in part handles issues related to victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. And we see details of the allegations from the women. And Mr. Aponte was allowed to retire, and to my knowledge has not been faced no criminal liability for the alleged incidents. I want to commend the governor of Oklahoma, Republican Kevin Stitt. He followed through on a campaign promise and on a ballot measure passed by the voters to reduce the prison population in Oklahoma, which has one of the highest per capita rates of imprisonment. Yesterday, 500 people went home from prisons in Oklahoma. I'd like to see that replicated in other states. And finally today, I want to say a farewell to John Conyers. He was an African-American congressman from Detroit, at one point the longest-serving member of the House. He was a longtime proponent of Medicare for All. He had the original single-payer health bill, I think it was 663. And I met John Conyers 4 or 5 times, interviewed him at various events I went to in Washington, D.C. I always found him to be very friendly, good sense of humor, and he always had a pretty young lady with him. That became his downfall because the Me Too movement caught up with John Conyers. Also, his wife Monica was sentenced to prison for a couple of years. She served on the city council there and got into trouble for misuse of campaign funds. But if you put aside the controversies, John Conyers was a great American leader, a man who served the people of Detroit, I think, quite well, and created a record, a legacy of a lot of good civil rights legislation. John Conyers, I wish that you rest in power. Thanks for joining me today for my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the place, especially in Detroit today, and in Humboldt County, Billy Cook. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.